I can't talk in miles per hour. Sorry. So I did convert the 70 miles per hour.
Kilometers,
31 meters
like
per
30.
second. No, meters per second.
Meters
if you're an
per
engineer,
second.
then a wind speed is measured in meters per second.
Fine. Welcome back. I'm Dan Blewett.
I'm Alan Hall.
And I'm Rosemary Barnes.
And this is the UPTIME podcast, bringing you the latest in wind energy tech, news, and policy. Welcome back to the UPTIME Wind Energy Podcast. I'm your co-host, Dan Blewett. On today's show, we're going to talk about a bunch about Ukraine and Russia. Obviously, this is what's enveloping the news cycle in the world. So we'll chat about that and all the energy implications today. Before we get going into that, we'll talk a little bit about some wind turbine destruction, some permitting issues in Europe. We'll talk about some fixed bottom offshore wind farms, and we'll talk about some new ship construction that is going to be compliant with the Jones Act here in the U.S. Before we do all that, be sure to subscribe to UPTIME Tech News, our weekly newsletter and updates about the podcast, as well as Rosemary's YouTube channel, where she's reporting on everything renewable and wind energy. So first thing here, Alan, there was a wind turbine destroyed in Cumbria it's a victim of this big storm, Dudley. We've talked about the still somewhat unproven, because a hurricane hasn't smashed through an offshore wind farm yet. But this was a pretty powerful storm, gusts of up to 70 mile per hour, and knocked some blades off, knocked some turbines to the ground. I mean, I guess my big question is, why did this storm seem so destructive? I mean, isn't this kind of typical? Like 70 mile per hour wind gusts aren't that high, are they?
No, they're not. Not in a hurricane situation or tropical storm situation. And I was doing a little research in some of the wind turbines that got knocked down in those storms, and it looked like the wind turbines were like one-off kind of wind turbines, or maybe had a maintenance issue. And I think that's going to be a bigger issue in the United States as going forward, because Dan, in the United States, there's local school districts have a wind turbine, or maybe the local sewer department has a wind turbine. And those one-off wind turbines, as they get older, are really hard to maintain unless you're really on top of it. You may have a structural issue inside the turbine, not know it until the winds are 70 miles an hour. That's I think the bigger issue. We had a wind turbine near us in Massachusetts at one of the ski resorts lose a blade a couple of weeks ago. Again, it was about a wind turbine, I think it was like 13 years old. So it's kind of getting its second half of life. And, how well are the blades maintained if it's a one-off turbine? Probably not as well as larger owner-operators are going to maintain their wind turbines. So I'm not surprised that a wind turbine got damaged. What I am a little more concerned about is, as we start expanding and growing into more wind in the United States, those solo wind turbines are going to have trouble just because of the expense of maintaining a wind turbine. It's like owning a very expensive car, like a Ferrari, right? For the first couple of years, probably not going to put a lot of money into it maintenance-wise, and then it's going to get super expensive. And it's a question of if you're going to put the money back into it or not to keep it alive. And Rosemary, some of these issues with the high winds have to do with blade fatigue or structural issues. I still don't understand how we're going to be able to handle hurricanes, tropical storms, typhoons, all the crazy winds, and particularly the water gets sloshed around in some of these storms. Is there really a way to know if we can make these wind turbines work without putting some up and just finding out?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's so different. The aerodynamic loads of a blade in I can't talk in miles per hour. Sorry. So I did convert the 70 miles per hour.
Kilometers,
31 meters
like
per
30.
second. No, meters per second.
Meters
if you're an
per
engineer, then a wind speed is measured in meters per
Fine.
second.
Fine.
And if you look at the IEC wind classes, because there are standards about how wind turbines need to be designed. They don't just like stick it up and hope that it lasts for whatever nature throws at it. So there's different wind classes. There's like high wind speed class 1, medium and low, and then there's now class 4, which I guess you'd call very low. And even in the very low wind speed class, the lowest, the maximum extreme load that blades have to withstand, it's the 50-year extreme gust wind speed. And if you look at the table, then even the very lowest wind class, that's 42 meters per second. So, like a third higher than what wind speed caused the failure in this case. So it's not a matter of the blade not being designed or the tower or any part of the wind turbine not being designed to withstand that. There's definitely a failure happened. And I mean, it's pretty well understood how the loads change with changing wind speed. So I think that the existing testing method should be able to accommodate a higher design wind speed or, to withstand a higher extreme gust. They'll do the same kind of testing, but just, put more force. It's really cool actually to see how wind turbine blades are tested. And one of the ones they do for the extreme load is that they will mount a blade just in a test rig. So it's, attached at the blade root. And then they'll just get a bunch of ropes and attach it along the blade and just pull on it, and if you ever, I've never been physically in the room for one, but every now and then the manufacturers will just keep pulling till it breaks just to, check that their models are right. They're not being too cautious. You don't do it often because a test blade is expensive to make. And I mean, so if you want to design a blade to withstand a higher wind speed, you would just test it by pulling harder on it. So I don't see that as a problem. I see the real problem with putting blades in wind turbines in more and more extreme environments is just that you need to make every component stronger in that case. And if it's just to withstand storms, then you've got a very expensive wind turbine now that's really overbuilt for average conditions so that, every 20, 30 years when a hurricane or whatever other kind of severe storm, when that comes through, it will withstand it. And so it's just not, the economics aren't as good as somewhere that doesn't have those extreme weather conditions.
So, Rosemary, you mentioned that the engineers designed the wind turbine blades to handle those loads. I totally agree with you. Let's talk about two separate issues here, though. First is the manufacturing quality of that particular blade, and maybe that particular blade is made in 3 or 4 different factories around the world. How consistent is the manufacturing of those blades? And second off, when you do that ultimate load test, you're only testing one blade to qualify it. It isn't like you're going through and testing multiple blades. How much variation is there structurally within a blade? And if you're making 1,000 or 5,000 blades, how much variation is there?
Yeah, so I mean, it is true that you'll usually only test one blade physically, but it's not quite true that they're only looking at one, because they are also looking at your design methods, and so that will include a bunch of other kind of tests that the wind turbine manufacturer has a history, because blades look effectively the same as they did 20 years ago for the most part, with some changes. But they know how strong their fiberglass is. Like they really know, from starting from coupon tests, small pieces that they test on, in the lab, then right up to the thousands and thousands of blades that they have put up out in the field with those same materials, similar structure, but not exactly the same. So all of that sort of thing is audited, and there are safety factors that are added to account for uncertainties. So the longer your history, the better your testing and your design methods and your quality processes are, then the less of a safety factor you'll have to add. So, if, it should cover everything, but you are right that the quality isn't exactly the same on every single blade. I mean, every blade that comes out of a wind turbine factory, it needs repairs done. You don't ever get a blade that comes out and it's just right. You're
Sure.
always doing some repairs. They're, using ultrasound scanning on some parts of the blade and visual inspections on others. Plus, like they try and do the exact same process every time. So, yeah, it's a manual and variable process, and so things do slip through the cracks. And yeah, that's why you do still see failures.
Is there a standard safety margin that's applied to blades on blade structure? Is it a 2x or 150%? Is there an industry standard on when you pull this blade, it must withstand double its design intent? Are those things in place, or depend? Okay.
It depends exactly what you're talking about, because it's not the same safety factor for every load and every single thing. But it's not double. It's like 1.35 would be a pretty normal load factor.
So that safety margin is actually derived from the manufacturing variability at times, and what you could see worst case in the field. I think a lot of times, like in the aviation community, the safety factors are based upon sort of manufacturing history and how well you can reasonably put things together. It may not be written down that way, but that's my impression. Okay, but on the wind turbine side, you hear more about compression of margins, safety margins, because of the history they have with blades. Does that go into the cycle as we go from like a 50-meter blade to a 120-meter blade? Does what happens with the 50-meter blade even make any difference of what happens with a 120-meter blade? It doesn't sound like they're kind of not the same animal. And do you apply the same safety factors?
That's that's definitely relevant to wind turbine blade design at the moment. That, from the 90s to the 2010s, blades basically did look exactly the same. It was the same structure, and it just, stretched a little bit every year. And they were nearly exactly the same. And you had very, very high certainty about how your blade was going to behave, because
Sure.
a 40-meter blade behaves basically the same as a 43-meter blade with the exact same geometry, basically only stretched. And now we've gotten longer still, and to the point where, because composite materials are, there's like multiple scales in there. You've got, a blade that might be 100 meters long, but then you've got these, the individual fibers inside the resin, then that's much less than a millimeter scale that's relevant there. And so you don't see everything just scaling up as you might expect if you're working with metals, for example.
Right.
And then the bigger difference is some of the changes that have happened. So adding carbon fiber would be an example of one. If we're moving to thermoplastic blades, like some manufacturers are trying to, that will obviously behave very differently and fail very differently than the blades they had before.
Sure.
And as you're well aware of, the lightning protection systems are very, very different.
Yes.
And then even, the structural impact of that can have an effect. If you've got a very different kind of lightning protection system, then the way that interacts with the blade structure might also cause some changes. So those are the places where you do tend to see more problems with, just using past experience to predict the future.
It just seems like we've run into some more recent blade failures that are odd. And as we get to these longer and longer blades, particularly offshore, I wonder if we actually know what the failure modes would be. And it sounds like because they're getting so big, the twisting can be an issue. Some of the flexing modes are different than what we probably have experienced before. So maybe our models aren't even as established. Structural engineers are really brilliant people, way outside my level of thinking.
Oh, we're amazing.
Yeah, exactly, right? But it does seem like we're going so fast. It's like this Elon Musk problem with SpaceX, right? You're going so fast, you're going to make mistakes. And if these mistakes, although are powering a large city, that's a problem. If Musk blows up a rocket, it doesn't really affect anybody too much. But on the electricity grid, it does make a difference. And I'm just wondering how we're going to address some of those issues, because I think the wind industry is about to explode. And with all the things that are happening in the Ukraine and the U.S. policy, I just all of a sudden there's going to be so much pressure on the industry to just massively build wind turbines. Are we ready for that?
I mean, I think all that is true. And then, offshore, there's a very different operating environment than there is onshore as well. So, manufacturers that are new to offshore will likely see some problems. Maybe they're just teething problems. But for me, the biggest thing that I'm worried about is the fact that there's, this, immense downward pressure on prices at the moment. A lot of manufacturers have, they're really trying to compete on price. And price alone practically. And, you know, some of the manufacturers have tried really hard to increase their market share, which has squeezed profit margins for everybody that's playing that game. And I think if you look back at the history of all the major manufacturers, most of them have gone through some period where, you know, the quality gradually declined, because they weren't putting the emphasis on it, assigning the budget to keeping quality high and, you know, allowing long enough development times to iron out the kinks before whole wind farms are installed with the new technology. And it takes a while. There's a lag, you know, between making that decision in your engineering budget before you start to see the impact on your claims budget. And so I am kind of expecting within the next few years to start seeing some manufacturers realize that they've got a huge quality problem that, you know, started several years ago.
Sure.
I think we'll see bankruptcies. That's my bold prediction. Or we'll see governments that, you know, give some support to the companies from, you know, in their country to continue, because I don't see that. I mean, you can say, yeah, okay, we're price sensitive. It's become, you know, wind turbines become a bit like a commodity, but it's not. It's a incredibly large, complicated, high-tech piece of equipment, and it's just simply not something that you can compete on price alone. But that's where we really have been for the last few years. So, yeah, I think that that's the solution, is that someone will go bankrupt and the survivors will spend more money on, you know, increasing development timeframes and spending more money on quality again. That's how I expect it to play out.
Well, Dan, you know, that's Rosemary raised some really good points. I disagree. I don't think we're going to see a bankruptcy, and I'll explain why. Dan, you had what's going on? Was it Vestas in the Ukraine and Russia? Are they pulling out of Russia at the moment? What's the latest news story there?
Vestas is going to freeze new commercial activity. So, you know, I'm not sure if they're pulling out. I don't know what that looks like, but, you know, they have a blade production facility in Russia and a nacelle assembly line. So they have a lot of turbine orders that are going to go through that, I suppose. And they're going to try to, I guess, wind all that down, at least for the time being.
So are they going to basically stop production in Russia? That's what it sounds like? Wow. Okay.
That's what it sounds like. Yeah. I'm not sure if that's exactly, you know, I think a lot of things are still unclear at this point, but that's what it sounds like they want to do. They don't want any new business.
Wow. Okay. So if Vestas is making that play, you have to think the GEs and the Siemens Gamesa are going to have to follow suit. I think that's probably in their best interest to do that. This European Union, Ukraine, Russia situation is really becoming more intense than I thought it was going to be even. And I was predicting it was going to get really ugly. And we got into the really ugly stage and probably beyond what I was thinking. The wind turbine industry, because, Rosemary, you're right. You're 100% right. The wind turbine industry is in a financial difficulty place because of supply chain issues, inflation, prices being pushed down. But right now, there's a unique little window of opportunity, right? It's like the Overton window of this situation, which is the European Union and the United States have been saying the words the last couple of days that they want to push renewable energy to provide electricity to the United States and wherever else where they can do it, and stop using Russian oil. That's sort of the second half of this, right? They're going to stop using Russian oil. Europe will have a little more difficult time doing that than the United States will. But what are you going to replace the oil with? And the electricity generated via oil on some level. I think you're going to have to go to renewables, and there's going to be a big push in renewables when you have governments standing up like that in the UK, United States, saying we need to go renewables. What that generally means is they're going to write several $100 billion of tax incentives or grants or gifts of cash to go out and get these wind turbines built and these solar farms built. And if I'm Vestas, GE, Siemens Gamesa, Nordex, pick one, and I realize that I'm really close to making hundreds of millions of dollars from these government grants, I may start tearing up contracts I have on existing wind farms and saying we're going to renegotiate. That's possible because GE's in a position right now where they can go to the United States government and say, hey, you're pushing for a renewable future. We are your renewable future. We're in the United States. If you can help us make some money, we'd love to stay in the United States and make wind turbines for you. And I have a hard time believing the Biden administration is going to walk away from that. For as much money that's been thrown out into the economy, trillions of dollars at a time, writing a $200 billion check to the industry would not be off the table, in my opinion. And that's why I don't think any of these companies are going to go bankrupt. I think they may accidentally roll into a situation where they may be extremely profitable. And Rosemary, you see how that could play out to their benefit? This crazy Ukraine-Russia situation, which is horrible, may have a very positive effect on renewable energy. Wouldn't have guessed it 6 weeks ago.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree. If they get some support, and it does sound like people at least some people are leaning towards, a faster rollout of renewables in order to decrease, dependence on foreign fossil fuels. I do see also a lot of people talking about shoring up, domestic fossil fuel sources. So I don't think it'll be, it's not guaranteed that it's going to be good for the energy transition. But definitely it's going to cost more because, we've already got supply chain problems. I know that in war times, people can manage to do many things that they are not able to do in peacetime. But, maybe this will be the incentive, big enough incentive that we need to actually finally start to, sort out some local production of things that we haven't bothered to produce locally because it was so easy to get them from overseas. And and energy would be one, and then a lot of the raw materials to make renewables as well would be another one, I think. And I do see steps in that direction, at least from the US, and other countries will probably also implement some more plans.
And Dan, you saw the latest Elon Musk tweets. Are you following Elon and all the latest comings and goings there?
I try to keep myself away from unhinged tweets in general, so I do not follow Elon Musk. I do hear through the grapevine, and there's an article, but his Twitter is getting him in trouble with the SEC again. He, as brilliant as he is, he seems to learn nothing from the times that he hurts his company through his social media use. But I don't know what you're referring to.
So Elon Musk put out a tweet, and maybe you're right. Maybe it's a midnight crazy tweet. But what Elon Musk was saying is we need to be drilling for oil in the United States, at least temporarily. That we can't all be driving electric vehicles tomorrow because we don't have an ability to make electric vehicles that fast, and we don't have the grid to support it. So in the short term, we're going to have to drill, do fracking. I think that's fair. And Rosemary seems very concerned about that. I'm more concerned about the war effort in Ukraine and how that's going. And maybe we suffer a little bit because we have a little higher emissions. But I think we're headed in the right direction.
I'm with you guys, and I guess I'm with Elon too. And I've seen some other people, Michael Liebreich, for example, is one who've said similar things on Twitter, which I am increasingly just hating Twitter as a place to hang out.
It's the worst. Everyone should leave Twitter.
It's the worst. And if you
immediately,
several people that
immediately.
I follow people elsewhere, like Michael Liebreich is a good example where, I follow his podcast. I follow him on LinkedIn. It's all reasonable, nuanced stuff. Agree with at least 80% of what he's saying. And then on Twitter, it's like, oh, this guy is such a jerk, like it's just horrible. I can't agree with anything he says there. I don't know. It's just it brings out like, inflammatory kind of ways of saying things and just being obnoxious to people. It's so uncool to say it, but I just really like the vibe on LinkedIn a lot more than I like the vibe on Twitter. You can talk about ideas more so than you're talking about people. But I did notice that, anybody who says, yes, we need to do the energy transition as fast as we can, but in the meantime, you can't go from 0 to 100 overnight. You have to ramp up. And in the meantime, the fastest way to get off, to stop supporting Russia via fossil fuel imports from there is to actually, increase fossil fuel production or imports from other places. that just hammered by, the kind of people who I'm usually siding with on environmental issues. So I think that there is this problem with a lot of climate change commentators who they tend to be all or nothing, it's like any fossil fuel is bad. But I kind of see if we, try and switch overnight to renewables before we have it in place, there's going to be huge disruption and shocks, and you're going to get everybody offside. I'm so excited to finally, after 20 years in the industry, see public support with us, the economics on our side, everything. We've got all the tailwinds in our favor for the very fast energy transition for the first time ever. And I don't want to ruin that,
You're in it though, but I think, Rosemary, this is actually going to accelerate it because I agree with you that we're going to have to burn a little more oil in the short term. But when countries are at war or in warlike conditions, they will do amazing things. And the United States has proven it has been able to do that numerous times. Europe has done the same thing. So we're on the precipice of a very unique adventure, and it's going to be an interesting time to live. And regardless of what is happening on Twitter, and Dan, you're probably right, we should all probably get off Twitter. At least saner minds are thinking alike, and I do see growth.
But I don't even see it as we need to burn more oil now. It's that we have to change the source of the oil that we're currently burning. We continue to transition away from it as soon as we can build wind turbines and build transmission lines and improve the insulation in our homes and install heat pumps. All those things will happen faster even because, there's added incentive and because the cost of fossil fuels has gone up. But we just have to, the fossil fuels that we do continue to need, we have to get them somewhere else. I don't see anybody really suggesting that we need to increase the amount of fossil fuels that we're using. It's just we have to increase the amount that we're producing so that we import less. That's my interpretation. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
The renewable industry is really stepped up, and it's time. Right? We're in a very unique time. This is sort of like our wartime effort to get the world cleaner. That's good.
Well, and you wonder if this is going to lead the world into like a pseudo isolationism. We don't want to be dependent on, the supply chain's already been a mess. And now as the US, the idea of drilling for oil in our backyard sounds good, almost like preparing your own bomb shelter. I want to make sure I have every food I could possibly need in case things get crazy again, right? Yeah. So you might start looking at the map and be like, okay, we get this from this country who's not too big and doesn't have a very big military, and this country, and this country, and this country. Maybe we need to start making all those things here at home, but that's also probably going to be unrealistic and unfeasible. Maybe. And it also might only last a short period of time. I don't know. It's weird because obviously at times like this, you want to be able to get everything at home. Yeah. But then again, that's not the way the world is because the composition of the Earth's crust is different depending on where you are, right? You can't just make up titanium deposits in the U.S. if they're not here, right? There's a lot in Russia.
There are,
Alan?
Most of the titanium deposits are in Russia. And we're still going to have that problem, that sourcing problem. But I think you'll find an alliance of countries like the United States and Australia and most of Europe, where they're going to figure out alternative plans. The one interesting country in all this energy crisis bit, which is France. France is sitting there sweet and pretty, and with their nuclear generators producing most of 70% of electricity in the country, they're not worried about Russian oil at the moment, not at all. And it's in these weird times where different approaches to energy and to supply chains play out, right? And you don't know who the winners and losers are. It could have been Germany, right? It could have been Germany. It doesn't look like it's going to be Germany, unfortunately, but it leads us into different directions. So we're looking at France, and Rosemary had a great YouTube video come out about nuclear energy, which I have to promote because I thought it was so good. Talking about, is smaller nuclear reactors in our future in the U.S., I think in particular. I think the answer is yes. I think it is. And France is sort of the model for that. I know they're struggling right now building new reactors and whatnot, but that's temporary. So, Rosemary has a sort of a quasi-philosophical objection to nuclear, which I completely understand. But I think you're going to see.
No, don't.
It's outlawed in Australia, and it's not outlawed in America. I assume there's like not a great nuclear future for Australia at the moment, but it's going to change.
It's outlawed in Australia. It's true. I don't care if it is or isn't. We don't need it in Australia. That's my opposition to it. It will never be the cheapest fuel, and clean energy source in Australia. It will certainly not be the fastest. You don't just go from zero nuclear industry to, it being a major contributor overnight. That takes a while to build that up. So,
it's a portfolio.
I don't like it for Australia for economics.
Energy's a portfolio, right? We've been told energy's a portfolio. You need a little bit of everything to make sure you don't run out of any of them. I think nuclear's.
You don't need a little bit of everything. Do you need wave energy? Do you need space-based solar power?
We do.
There's a lot of piezoelectric roadways. There's a lot of ways you can make energy. You need a variety of good technologies.
Kangaroos on hamster wheels.
Exactly.
That's
feasible.
A huge energy source.
But maybe not economically feasible.
Well, no, okay. So, there's when we're talking about gigawatts of power, you'll sort of limit that down, right? You're not piezoelectric roadways are not going to produce gigawatts of electricity, but nuclear reactors will, wind will, solar will, oil will, right? And gas will, hydro will. So, there is a subset in there of real things that could be done. And don't you think that even in places like Australia, which has outlawed nuclear, we'll start looking at it? Because I think the answer is yes. It's not today. I'm not saying tomorrow Australia is going to change the law. I do not see that at all. But if other countries are successful, it'll take some of the pressure off. And if they can reduce the cost of it.
It might happen eventually if in 2100 when we've got nuclear fusion and it's just
on Mars in 2100.
We might, okay. Yeah, we might be pulling down solar farms there to reclaim the land.
We're never going to live on Mars. Never.
I wouldn't rule it out eventually, but I think nuclear is an important part, and maybe I would even go so far as to say it's a necessary part of the whole world's energy transition.
There we go.
But it doesn't mean every country is going to need it. And Australia is like top of the list of countries that don't need nuclear. Okay. We have such an easy transition here, way more wind and solar and land than we need, not very challenging seasonal energy use patterns. We don't need to do the hard stuff here. Whereas in the US, actually your energy transition is amongst the easiest too. You could probably do without nuclear. If it gets cheap, then you'll use it. That's what I think. And then other countries like Northern Europe, and probably, I don't know, maybe Canada as well, countries where they've just got a little bit more of a seasonal challenge. I think nuclear, it'll be a lot harder for them to do without it than if they include it in their mix.
Well, here's a question for either of you. Now, we've lived the last 50 years in a pretty peaceful era, globally. Do we need to now start designing our energy systems for war? Imagine you live in the desert and you have one water tank. Like you collect some rain or you do whatever. You have one water system. If someone wants to come ransack your home and they take that offline, that's maybe the end of you, right? If you have one or two big nuclear reactors that provide a huge amount of power for a relatively small country that borders lots of other countries, are you really fragile in the prospect of war in the next 20 to 30 years? Like the United States is in a rare situation where we have a huge moat of water. It's hard to get to the U.S. if you want to attack us and invade us, our military aside. But if you're a small country like France and you have a lot of nuclear power, are you really, really susceptible to just a couple of airstrikes that take out your nuclear reactors? Is that something that people need to realistically start thinking about now that we've sort of had this spell broken, this peaceful era broken, realizing that, I'm sure a lot of other countries with relatively small militaries are realizing this is a real thing that could happen.
Well, yeah, I think didn't Denmark just decide to increase its defense budget or NATO budget to 2% of its GDP, something like that. So yeah, and the answer to that is yes. I think there's a lot of European countries getting in a defensive military position in terms of arming themselves. And there's talk of Japan sounds like they're going to step up in some things, and Germany too. And the infrastructure for the power networks and the energy networks are going to be hardened also. I think they're going to have ways of rerouting power like they sort of do already. But you're right, Dan. It's gonna be a difficult transition in the United States. Remember, it wasn't that long ago we were talking about electromagnetic pulses wiping out the entire U.S. electrical grid. Now, I don't think it's as susceptible now as it was, say, 10 years ago. But in these situations where war percolates up to the top, you'll see changes in regulations that are going to harden things up. I think and Rosemary, you can chime in here, but I think there's also a risk of basically software attacks, right? Internet attacks, shutting down grids. We've already had it happen in the United States where they shut down pipelines. Everybody's going to step up and really clean house in terms of its energy systems, because you can't disconnect like the Northeast of America from the electrical grid without being massive problems. And so you need to harden those systems. And Europe's going to do the same thing. But I do see, though, clearly that you're going to have energy independence. Every country will be talking about energy independence in the next month, Australia included, because you just can't have a significant part of your energy grid system dependent on another country that you may not be friendly with or plan not to be friendly with. It's a huge problem.
But does that make you even more fragile? Because then if you get attacked, now you don't have a inroad for other people to help you and get you the energy you need if you're, again, kind of isolated. I don't know, Rosemary, where do you fall on all of this?
Well, I think that, resilience should always be a consideration, whether you're in peacetime or you're contemplating wartime. An attack is not the only way that your energy system can go down. I mean, there've been cyber attacks happening a bit recently, including maybe by Russia, I think some people are saying. And there's also, there's other things in California and in Australia. There's all these bushfires that, can cause communities to get cut off. As always, whenever there's a storm, there's power lines that blow down. And, if that was the only line in or out, then that, will put people into blackouts. And distributed energy should be a way to improve resilience if we do it right. You have, grids that are able to operate in island mode. So you probably still keep everything connected, but they can operate in isolation. And, like if you have a lot of houses with rooftop solar, then that can, and some, small batteries, community batteries or household batteries, that can really keep things going for a long time, especially if people are, reducing their demand for a while. So I think that that's going to be important, and then make sure that it's not all controlled by one satellite connection, so that, you take down one satellite link and suddenly your whole country's, got no internet or electricity. It's not, you don't have to know what the threat is to know that you can't have single points of failure for a really critical system like electricity grids. So, I think that's always been important, and people maybe haven't given it as much attention as they should have. And I'm sure they will now, because now the threat is, obvious to everyone.
Well, I hate to bring this back to Elon Musk, but let's bring it back to Elon Musk. I think he just solved two of those problems. Right, the internet problem with their Starlink, and right, they've been sending terminals over to the Ukraine, and they've been lowering the power needed to operate those ground stations. That makes the internet possible. It'd be very difficult to take out Starlink because there's so many satellites. And the second is Musk doing all the solar grid and the batteries, the Tesla wall battery thing. So Dan, you could be your own independent power station, I guess. I mean, you could, Dan's power station could be powering the neighborhood. If the your state was without power, you could actually be powering your home plus a couple of others, like Rosemary said. So you become interconnected, weirdly such. And I haven't thought of it that way, but Musk may have connected us and made us somewhat resilient to cyber attacks and really hard war attacks. Isn't that crazy? Oh my gosh, I haven't thought of it before, but I think he did it.
Well, let's jump back to EVs for a moment, because let's talk about some of the implications for speeding up, the transition away from fossil fuels. Obviously, right now, everyone's like, hey, gas is really expensive. Give me an electric car. Sign me up. I'm ready. Like, I'm no more qualms. But everyone else is like, hey, okay, we'll put you on the wait list. So how's 2025 for you? Does that sound good? We'll get you a Tesla. We'll get you a new GM platform EV. Are we going to see people able to transition out, or municipalities going to be able to transition out of, their current energy sources anytime soon? Or is this kind of one of those things where, hey, everyone's ready to work at home, but like Zoom has limited capacity, so you got to stay in the office, right? Like, the pandemic changed the way we worked, and this could seemingly change the way we use energy, but it doesn't seem like we have the capacity to do that. Rosemary, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a transition. It's not like you don't just jump off a cliff and then you jump off the cliff of fossil fuels into the,
Well, you don't need energy if you jump off a cliff. No.
Great.
Unless you have a parachute
a lot of kinetic
inverter
energy there.
Actually, I do have a live stream coming up on airborne wind power, so that is relevant.
All right.
It's a transition. I think most of us in the industry have been frustrated by how slow it's been going. Certainly I'm less frustrated now than I was, 15 years ago when it felt like we were going nowhere. We've got some movement now, but things could go much faster if we could sort out, some of the regulatory issues, building out transmission faster, and, a few other things, especially like getting the smart grid working. And I think that this might be the incentive that we need these problems don't need to take a long time to solve. So, some of them, transmission as one example. People don't like power lines running through their property, but it solves a big problem. And I think that, with a little bit more reason why you can see like the urgency of doing it, I think some of these projects should be able to go a lot faster. And I know in Europe, they're really just crying out to get rid of some bureaucracy so that they can, roll projects out faster. These are not real obstacles, they're, politically imposed obstacles for the most part. And I think that sense of urgency is what's been missing. So we'll get that now. And I think that we'll go a lot faster than we have been. But that said, it's still not an overnight thing, and things will happen. There's a ramp rate. And I think we need to do everything at once. You need to install heat pumps, but you can't only install heat pumps because you need upgrade the transmission so that you can have a lot more electricity. You need to increase
Plus, no one knows how heat pumps work. So are people
everyone
really
knows because they went and
dominate?
checked out my video on it in between the episodes since we last talked about it.
Man, it's shameless. It's shameless YouTube plug week here on Uptime.
Yeah. We need to do all that. We need to improve insulation in homes. We need to get EVs, do it all at the maximum rate that we can, and that will give us the fastest solution. But I get a bit tired of people saying, oh, we can't do this overnight, so it's not a solution. What big solution to a big world problem ever happened overnight? You do it as fast as you can, and that's how you get there as fast as you can.
Spoken like a true engineer.
Well, you wonder what the world is going to do, as obviously we have no idea how the Russia-Ukraine conflict is going to progress. And any of it, right? It's anyone's guess. But you also just wonder, what are they going to do with all that oil, right? It's just going to, they sell $100 million worth of oil a day in Russia, and
it's going to China.
Are countries going to acquiesce just in a couple of months, just quietly start buying it again? Alan, where do you see that going? They're going to have this gigantic stockpile. Their economy is going to be in collapse, obviously, but where do you see that going?
Russia is already working on deals with China. I think that's where the oil will go, and numerous others. But China is the big marketplace. That's where Russia has to go. They're going to have to, instead of facing westward, face east and start negotiating deals with China. The problem with that, if you're Russian, is that China wields a lot of weight. and they can also cut you off. So if China can make it hurt, so they're probably going to be discounting oil to get it into China, which is then going to hurt Russia's economy even more. And so it's like a cyclical bad spot that Russia has put itself in. I think I basically understand what Russia's concern is with the Ukraine, but because we're all interconnected right now, unloading oil will be very difficult to do. It isn't like in the 1980s when, or even in the 2000s when like Venezuela was trying to smuggle in oil places and the U.S. was trying to stop that from happening. It's really hard to sneak things around in the world anymore because there's so many satellites. Everybody's watching all the time. It's hard to do that. The same thing like North Korea was trying to do the same thing, and U.S. was all over watching all of that. So Russia's cornered, and I think that's why everybody is a little concerned, because if Russia's cornered, they have nuclear weapons, and it's not like they wouldn't use them if it got desperate enough. And this is where sort of the diplomacy part comes in, and how much stress you want to put on Russia versus is there an out? Where's the out? And how are we going to manage the out? And what does that look like? But you, in the process of all this happening, you may upset so many European nations that they won't deal with Russia for the next 20, 30 years. I think that's very likely. So, what does a world look like, Dan? You and I have kind of lived in Rosemary too. I don't want to be out of this, Rosemary. I've lived in a very quasi-stable time.
I'm the youngest. I've lived through the least of any of us three. But maybe, my maturity is shining through. I'm 48 in maturity years. Yeah, appreciate you.
So, I was born in sort of Vietnam era, and I remember all that. And, obviously the Gulf Wars and all those things happened in the 90s. Lived through that. Those are really bad times. This seems worse because we've never had a real fight in European territory. That's outside the bounds. And that the whole time with Ronald Reagan and all the things that were happening in the 1980s was about preventing nuclear war with the Soviet Union. And we thought we were out of it in 1991 or 92, where we thought we had moved on since then. And now we're kind of back in that mode again. It's a different world. It's a different world. And unless you have lived through it, you just don't know.
Well, there's certainly going to be positives that come from this. Obviously, it's a terrible thing that's going on, but just like if you live on a street where a bunch of cars get broken into, what happens? Everyone starts being better about not leaving valuables out. This is what happens in all sorts of scenarios. Unfortunately, bad things have to happen to someone first. And in this case, it's Ukraine. For everyone else to start, like we've already said, bolstering their military, how many countries are either trying to join the EU or NATO? There's a lot of other countries who realize we're not that different than Ukraine. And we don't have the military to fight a country like Russia. So it's going to be a positive for them that unfortunately Ukraine was attacked first, that they now have a chance to do things to make sure they're not the next target. And we probably have the same net positive in reinforcing our grids and realizing that, hey, Russia's going to be angry at everyone. So they're probably going to go on a crazy offensive on cybersecurity. So everyone right now is saying, okay, how can we prevent and harden every single system that we have because we could be in this fight for 20 more years. And it's, very likely that cybersecurity is going to be a nightmare for the next long term. Because even if Russia's like, hey, we're going to back out of Ukraine, they're still going to probably come after everybody.
Absolutely.
Right? Because cybersecurity is seemingly much more innocuous, even though it's not, than actually throwing munitions into someone's backyard.
A cyber attack could be billions of dollars or hundreds of billions of dollars if done right. So Russia can hurt the United States. Russia can hurt Europe. Russia can hurt Australia. Russia can hurt Japan if they chose to. And that's the scary part, right? And Dan, I think you highlighted a really good point that there's going to be a lot of changes happening in a lot of countries to harden systems up and to better prepare for what may be somewhat inevitable or what a future could look like to prevent that bad future from occurring. And it's going to change. The discussion we were having the other day was mindsets have to change. You have to prioritize things. This is sort of the engineering part that comes in is, okay, what comes first, right? We need to prioritize where we're going here because there's only so many resources. What are you going to do first? You're going to harden the electrical grid? You're going to go to renewables? You're going to drill more? Or are you going to make electric vehicles? Or, are you going to get the cybersecurity thing really figured out? Are we going to talk Web 3.0, and we're all going to move over to sort of Bitcoinish sort of currencies? All those things are still wide open right now. We need to figure out, have a plan of attack. And right now, the United States is still, if you watch Twitter, if you look at Twitter, right now it's just chaos. Everybody's going in every direction. There is no plan. And that's bad, right? We should have had some sense of what this Russia-Ukraine thing, how it was going to play out. And we don't. And that's the worrisome part. It's going to, I think Rosemary's right. It's going to take a couple of years to get organized. And in that time frame, Dan, I think you're right. Cyber attacks are probably number one on Russia's list to hurt the United States. And they'll probably pull that trigger. They have a little bit already. But if they really want to make it hurt, they haven't done that yet. But that may be yet to come.
Well, and it also could be as part of a bigger plan to get people back dependent on oil. If you take a bunch of countries' other power sources offline, now they're really hurting. Then maybe they double back on their embargo for oil, because if, tons and tons of wind farms go off and 8% of your power goes offline in addition to, the oil embargo, you might say, listen, we want to keep this intact, but we can't. We need Russian oil now. I mean, that seems like that could be a legitimate way for them to sort of fight back against some of these sanctions, is to go after other countries from a cybersecurity standpoint. Rosemary, do you think that's plausible?
Yeah, I'm not much of a military strategist, so I don't know if I've got a whole lot to add on that specifically, but I do know that in Europe I know there's not a lot of people alive now who literally remember the last World War, but they do kind of culturally remember it, especially in Germany, in a way that we definitely don't in Australia, and I don't think that you do in the US either. I mean, we didn't have the wars really in our countries, only, the tiniest little bit. And I know that in Germany, especially, they're like constantly on the lookout for, this reminds us of, one of the first things that Hitler did. And so I think that people are more wary of not repeating the mistakes that they did with Hitler, including, people were probably too careful to try to avoid war at all for the Second World War. And I think that will make them more cautious to repeat the mistakes. So I would expect people to, come down harder on Russia now than they did on Germany in the early days of that whole conflict.
Yeah, and I think just to make sure we're clear here, when we're speaking of Russia, I think there's a difference between the Putin government and the Russian population. I think the Russian population probably doesn't want to get in some long-term war. Have we seen over the last 30 years, since the wall has fallen in the former Soviet Union and in Russia, Russia has been a lot more open and a lot more, the people have been a lot more open than what we would known in the 1970s. It's just a totally different world. And I don't necessarily feel sorry, but I do feel some angst for the people of Russia, because they're caught in a really bad situation. They're going to be paying for their government's leadership for the next 20 years, probably. And that's not what you want. You don't wish that on anybody. And you wish that the leadership would realize the pinch they're going to be in, and it's not worth it. Because I think the Russian citizens deserve this at all.
All right, well, that's going to do it for this week's episode of the Uptime Wind Energy Podcast. Thanks so much for listening. Be sure to subscribe wherever you listen on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, YouTube. Definitely check out Uptime Tech News. You can subscribe below to our weekly newsletter and podcast updates, as well as Rosemary's YouTube channel, where you've heard just countless plugs for her incredible videos. All kidding aside, she does do a great job. So definitely check her out for everything renewable energy. We'll see you here next week on Uptime. Operating a profitable wind farm is all about mitigating costs, minimizing risks, and being efficient with maintenance, repairs, and upgrades. It's incredibly expensive to send a team of rope access technicians up tower to make even simple repairs. We also know how costly lightning damage can be, requiring inspection, repairs, and downtime for even minor lightning strikes. Maximize the time efficiency of your techs and prevent future lightning damage by installing our Strike Tape LPS upgrade the next time your crews are going up on ropes. Learn more in today's show notes or visit us on the web at weatherguardwind.com.